They tried to silence him without a trace, a calculated move quietly prepared. But what they didn't expect was who was already watching from the shadows. Before we continue, subscribe to this channel, a channel that stands with Ibrahim Traoré and the rise of a stronger independent Africa. He was not meant to walk away that day. Everything was in place, timing, location. Silence. But as the threat closed and something unexpected happened, the morning felt unusually calm as President Ibrahim Traoré prepared for a discreet convoy departure through the outskirts of Ouagadougou. His security team had checked the route 3 times, but the stillness in the air carried a strange tension. Unbeknownst to them, hidden eyes were watching not local rebels, but men with foreign training and sophisticated gear. The trap was set miles ahead, not with loud explosions, but with a silent strike designed to leave no trace behind. A drone hovered miles above, invisible to the naked eye, locked on its coordinates. Inside a dark command room far from the city, the order was whispered, not shouted. Precision, not power, was the goal. Eliminate without noise, without bodies, without blame. This was not a rebellion. It was a message tailored for global ears, but meant to stay secret. And Traoré, the man challenging the world order, was not meant to see another sunrise. But the operation had one fatal flaw: it underestimated who was already in position. Inside an unmarked van parked in an abandoned warehouse near the flight path, 2 men sat silently. They weren't from Burkina Faso. They didn't wear flags or speak much, but their eyes never left the radar. One turned to the other and gave a slight nod. The signal had come earlier than expected. The drone signal was intercepted mid-flight, rerouted just enough to miss its intended moment, and in that fraction of a second, the mission's fate shifted without anyone realizing yet. As Traoré's vehicle passed the vulnerable checkpoint, a low buzz cracked in the comms channel. "Stand by," a voice ordered, deep and accented, not from West Africa, but somewhere colder. The driver slowed instinctively, feeling something was wrong, though no one could explain why. Seconds later, a black military-grade vehicle blocked the road and motioned frantically. Before panic could rise, Traoré saw the face in the window and realized this was not a threat. The man who stepped out wore no rank, no insignia, and yet radiated authority. He opened the armored door himself and looked Ibrahim in the eyes. "No time," he said. "You're being hunted, come with us now." There was no debate, only movement, practiced, silent, precise. Traoré followed without resistance, instincts louder than his doubts. Inside the extraction vehicle, everything was padded, silent, and shielded. No phones, no trackers, only brief signals bouncing through foreign satellites. For the first time that day, Ibrahim sat in silence and felt the weight of the ambush. But he also felt something else, a presence far greater than a rescue. Whatever this was, it had started long before the convoy even rolled out. He turned to the man beside him, who offered a simple phrase: "Moscow never leaves its friends unprotected." And in that chilling calm, the silence said more than words ever could. The precision strike had failed, and the story was only just beginning. Traoré looked out the window, his hands still steady, and whispered to himself. They knew. The vehicle moved fast, but not recklessly. Its route was one no map would suggest: off-paved roads through alleyways and back entrances, known only to those who study war. Traoré remained calm, but his thoughts raced. Who ordered this, and how deep did the betrayal go? Only a handful knew his movements that day. That meant the leak came from inside. This was not an amateur ambush. It was orchestrated with military precision. As the van sped through an industrial tunnel, Ibrahim observed the man across from him. He was built like a soldier, but moved like a ghost. No name, no rank, only the cold discipline of someone who had seen too much. At his belt hung a radio marked in Cyrillic letters, confirming what Ibrahim had suspected. These were not mercenaries. These were Russian operatives, sent with purpose. The silence inside the van was broken only once. You were not supposed to survive today, the man said. Traoré didn't flinch. But I did because of you. The man did not respond. His focus returned to the window, scanning every shadow. That silence was louder than any explosion. It confirmed the gravity of the threat, and it revealed something else. This rescue had been planned long before today. Somewhere along the border, another vehicle trailed them by 5 kilometers. Inside were agents from a Western intelligence unit watching from a distance. They had expected to clean up after the strike, not witness its failure. But what shook them wasn't the failed operation. It was who had intervened. They immediately recognized the tactical pattern. Only one nation operated like that in Africa. Back in a remote compound in Moscow, a secure line buzzed twice before being answered. A man in a dark uniform listened without interrupting, nodding slowly. He already knew. The intercept had come hours earlier. The rescue was confirmation. The mission was not just to save Traoré, but to send a message. Africa was no longer a chessboard. Burkina Faso had defenders. As they reached the edge of a military zone disguised as farmland, the van slowed down. A jet engine hummed in the distance, not commercial, not local. Traoré stepped out to see a small gray aircraft being prepped silently on a private runway. No questions were asked and no answers were given. The plan was already in motion and had been for days. Standing under the soft morning light, Ibrahim turned to the Russian officer. I will not run, he said firmly. This is my country. The officer nodded with respect. We are not here to relocate you, only to protect your position. That one sentence changed everything. This was not an escape, it was reinforcement. And whatever came next, Traoré would be ready now, with eyes watching from the cold, far away from the runway. In the northern district of Ouagadougou, whispers began to circulate. Locals had heard something, not an explosion, not a gunshot, but a silence too perfect to trust. Vendors' closed early phones rang with vague warnings. No one knew what had happened, only that something had almost happened. And by evening, people began saying the same words. Traoré was not supposed to make it. Inside the presidential office, aides moved like shadows, nervous, alert, confused. The president was unreachable, off-grid, and not responding to official calls. Some feared a successful coup. Others feared something worse. Foreign intervention. But one man sitting quietly in the back corner said nothing at all. His name was not on public records, but he held a senior intelligence post. He was the one who had received the intercepted signal too late to stop it, but just in time to warn the Russians. His loyalty had always been with Traoré, but even he knew the enemy was inside. Now he watched his colleagues scramble, pretending to act while the real decisions were made elsewhere. He quietly placed his phone on the table and pressed a hidden code. A message was sent, encrypted and urgent. The nest is compromised. Plan Omega confirmed. Back near the hidden airstrip, Ibrahim stood beside the Russian officer, watching as the aircraft powered down. He was not boarding. He was debriefing. The men who had pulled him out were now showing him something. A black case was opened. Inside, photographs, intercepted texts, and maps. Every detail of the ambush had been laid out, including the names of the informants. And one of them was someone Ibrahim had once considered family. His jaw tightened as he studied the final photo. It was an aide, one he had trusted for years. The betrayal was not just strategic, it was personal. That man chose payment over patriotism, the Russian officer said plainly. Traoré said nothing, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. For him, this was no longer about survival. It was about exposure. The Russian continued. We believe the strike was coordinated with offshore assets, funding traces to a European bank. That changed everything. This was not a local plot, this was international. And it confirmed Ibrahim's suspicion. His leadership threatened more than just African elites. It rattled the foundations of those who feared African independence might become contagious. He now knew the stakes and who truly feared his voice. As the case was closed and the documents stored, the officer extended a simple choice. "We can make this disappear," he said, "or we can make it public." Ibrahim looked toward the dusty horizon and replied with certainty, "No more silence. If they want war in the shadows, I'll bring light to the darkness." The officer nodded. A new phase had begun, one that could no longer be hidden. The sun began to rise over Ouagadougou, casting a golden light over the rooftops. But inside the presidential palace, darkness lingered, not in the halls, but in the intentions. Word had spread that Traoré had survived something, though no one dared to ask what. The same aide who had betrayed him walked through the corridors with forced calm. He smiled at colleagues and offered polite nods, hiding the terror beneath his skin. He had received confirmation the previous night, a coded message saying, "It's done." But now no one was celebrating. There was no announcement, no media shock. Instead, radio silence filled the airwaves, and the aide began to sweat beneath his tailored suit. He glanced at his phone. The Russian encryption was still active. That was the first sign that the plan had failed, and that he was exposed. Meanwhile, Traoré was not hiding. He had returned quietly through an alternate route disguised in plain clothes. He entered through the back of a government building. Only 3 people knew he was there: the Russian officer, a loyal colonel, and the intelligence chief. They greeted him not with ceremony, but with strategy. Time was no longer a luxury. The countermove had to begin immediately. Inside a private conference room, maps were unrolled and locations were marked in red. "We have narrowed the origin of the strike to a remote facility," the Russian explained. Traoré studied the data, absorbing each name, each number, each city. His silence was strategic, the way a lion watches before it strikes. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I want every one of them identified." Elsewhere in the city, the people remained unaware of what had nearly happened. Children walked to school markets. Opened radios played music as if nothing had shifted. But in quiet corners, rumors began. Why hasn't the president spoken today? Some wondered if he had left the country. Others whispered of a coup already crushed, and still others looked to the north, saying, "Something is coming. I feel it." Back at the palace, the traitorous aide entered his private quarters and locked the door. He poured a glass of water, hands shaking, and looked at himself in the mirror. Behind him, his phone vibrated just once, a single alert. No name, no words, only an image, the exact moment Traoré stepped out of the black van alive. His knees gave out. The message was clear: they were coming for him next. The game had changed. This was no longer a plot in the shadows. The hunter had become the hunted, and the lion had returned to his territory. But Traoré was not planning revenge. He was preparing revelation. He did not want silence. He wanted exposure, names, faces, and motives. And with powerful allies now watching, the traitors would learn what true fear feels like. In a remote building on the outskirts of Bamako, Mali, a secret meeting was already underway. 6 men sat around a table, none of them locals, and none of them unfamiliar with war. They spoke in whispers, glancing at encrypted laptops and black phones. Operation failed. One of them said, "Extraction intercepted, Russian involvement confirmed." Another leaned forward and muttered, "Then it is worse than we feared. Traoré has backup." These were not rebels. These were consultants. Former intelligence officers turned private strategists. They had helped orchestrate coups before, in places no one remembered for prices, no one questioned. But Burkina Faso was different. It was not about money, it was about control, and Traoré's continued rise was a symbol too dangerous to be ignored. They had underestimated his reach, and worse, his alliances. Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a small screen in a windowless room. Live footage streamed from a reconnaissance drone showing a compound deep in the bush. "This is where they coordinated the signal," said the Russian officer beside him. "Foreign handlers, high-frequency comms, satellite bounce confirmed." Traoré's expression did not change, but his silence was heavy with intention. He turned to his colonel and gave a single command: no mercy. A plan unfolded in real time, not for retaliation, but for exposure. He wanted footage, confessions, documents every thread pulled until the full network collapsed. This was no longer a game of defense. It was an operation of surgical dismantling. And those who had hidden in the shadows would now face the light. Meanwhile, international news outlets began to notice a strange silence in Burkina Faso. No public appearance from the president, no official statements, only rumors and speculation. Some said he had fallen ill. Others believed he was overthrown. But in Moscow, a private message was delivered to a senior official: the eagle still flies. It was code, meaning Traoré was alive, operational, and watching. In a high-rise office in Geneva, a financier received a flagged transaction alert. He traced the source to West Africa and froze. The money trail was visible. The same account that funded the operation had just been exposed, not hacked, but revealed. The Russians had not only intercepted the attack, they had followed the money. And that meant names would surface, even in European boardrooms. As evening fell again in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim walked a quiet corridor in the military complex. He paused at a window, looking out at the capital he had sworn to defend. He was not smiling. He was planning. The strike may have failed, but it had drawn lines in the sand, and those lines would soon be crossed with full force and zero hesitation. A quiet knock echoed through the back entrance of the presidential security wing. It was past midnight, and only a few trusted guards were on duty. One of them opened the door cautiously, only to find a tall figure in civilian clothes. No badge, no name, just a phrase whispered in perfect French: "I bring the final list." Within minutes, the man was seated before Traoré. A thick folder rested on the table. Inside the folder were names, not dozens, but hundreds: politicians, bankers, former officers, even media figures. Every one of them had either funded, enabled, or ignored the plot against the president. The intelligence had not come from just one agency, but three. Traoré flipped through the pages, slowly absorbing betrayal after betrayal. "They never believed you would rise," the messenger said, almost with pity. "To them, you were a placeholder, loud, temporary, and replaceable. But now you are the voice of a continent, and that terrifies them." Ibrahim said nothing. He did not need validation. What he wanted now was truth not whispered, but shouted. In a dimly lit studio inside the secure compound, cameras were set up. It was not for a press conference. It was for documentation. Every fact, every map, every financial trail would be shown first to allies, then to the world. No drama, no accusations, only evidence. Because Traoré understood something his enemies did not silence: breeds rumors, but truth ends wars. Across the ocean, in a city with mirrored skyscrapers, an emergency meeting was held. Analysts studied the latest intercepts from West Africa and confirmed what they feared: the failed strike had triggered something they could no longer control: exposure. And the man they once dismissed was now in possession of files that could unravel decades of influence. Panic spread behind closed doors while the public remained unaware. Meanwhile, in a remote village north of Bobo Dioulasso, an elder turned on a dusty radio. The signal was faint, but what he heard made his heart pause. A local reporter, speaking nervously, began to read the names of known collaborators. Not loud, not dramatic, just a list delivered with calm and certainty. Within hours, the streets began to whisper the same names. The president had received. Traoré watched from a small monitor, his face still unreadable. One of his aides approached and asked, "Shall we begin the official statement?" He waited a beat, then replied, "Not yet. Let them hear the truth first, not from me, but from each other." It was not just strategy, it was poetic justice. And for the first time since the failed strike, Ibrahim allowed himself one small smile. In the early hours of the morning, a convoy of unmarked vehicles moved silently through the city. There were no sirens, No flags, no announcement, only intention. Inside, the lead car sat a commander from the Presidential Guard, handpicked by Traoré himself. Their destination was not a government building, but a private residence on the city's edge. The man they were coming for had once served beside Traoré and then sold him out. As the door burst open, the target barely had time to reach for his phone. He was pinned to the floor not with violence, but with precision. The guards said nothing. They showed no anger. Only duty. A sealed envelope was placed on the table beside him. It contained the evidence of his betrayal signed and stamped. Back at the command post, Traoré watched the operation unfold in real time. He did not flinch. He did not speak. This was not about revenge. It was about restoring balance. One by one, every hidden hand would be revealed, and each revelation would be handled, not in the streets, but in strategy rooms. Across the region, embassies began requesting urgent briefings. What was happening in Burkina Faso no longer felt like internal conflict. It felt like the unmasking of a global game that had gone too far. Some diplomats were recalled, others were warned, and behind the polished walls of foreign missions, fear took root. In a media office in Accra, a journalist stared at her screen in disbelief. She had just received an anonymous leak, hours of footage, and thousands of documents, all pointing to the same conclusion. Traoré had been marked, and someone wanted him erased. But he had survived, and now he was taking control of the narrative. She knew the risk, but she also knew history was unfolding. Meanwhile, the Russian officer returned to the capital quietly, avoiding attention. He met Traoré in a secure location and handed him a drive. "No loose ends," he said. "You asked for truth? This is all of it." Traoré nodded, placing the drive inside a drawer without ceremony. He knew what it held and what it could unleash if necessary. As night fell once again, the capital buzzed with tension. But inside the presidential residence, there was no chaos, only calm. Traoré stood by a window, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had survived not just the strike, but the deeper war behind it. And now he was ready to speak, not in whispers, but with the full weight of truth. The following morning, a quiet tension swept across the presidential cabinet room. Only a select group had been called in, and even fewer knew the real reason. Traoré entered without an escort, dressed in a simple uniform, not for show, but for message. He walked slowly to the head of the table, placed a single document in front of him, and sat down. No greetings, no speeches, just a long pause that commanded absolute silence. He looked each official in the eye, not with anger, but with certainty. These pages contain the names of those who knew, who enabled, and who remained silent, he said. A few shifted in their seats. Others froze. You have one chance to step forward now. He continued, or live with the consequences when the truth goes public. The room held its breath, but no one spoke, not yet. In the corner stood the intelligence chief, arms crossed, eyes sharp. He already knew who the weak links were. He had tracked their movements, intercepted their calls. But this moment was symbolic, a chance for confession before confrontation. One man, trembling, stood up. I didn't know how deep it went," he muttered. Traoré nodded slowly. "Then, now you know, and now you choose." Outside the building, the streets buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word had spread that something massive was coming, not violence, but revelation. Vendors whispered updates between customers. Taxi drivers debated timelines. For the first time, the public was not afraid. They were alert. And in Burkina Faso, alertness was a form of resistance. Across the border, a foreign ambassador packed his bags quietly. He had received a message from his own government: withdraw before the curtain lifts. The embassy staff didn't understand the urgency, but he did. He had read the reports. He knew the files had been leaked, and he suspected his own name might appear in one of them. Back in the palace, Traoré met once more with the Russian liaison. This time, There were no hard drives or folders, only a single question. "Are you ready to release it?" the officer asked. Traoré didn't hesitate. "The people are ready, and so am I." The liaison nodded. Then history will remember who spoke first and who stayed silent. That evening, at exactly 8 URSURL, the presidential signal interrupted all major broadcasts. No music, no commentary, only a direct feed from a single room. Traoré stood alone behind a wooden desk, the national flag beside him. His face was calm, but his message was fire. He began to speak, and not to governments, but to his people and to the world. "I was never meant to stand here today." Traoré began, his voice steady and clear. He paused briefly, letting the silence land before continuing. "There were forces both near and far that attempted to erase me, not just from office but from existence. Across living rooms, shops, and open markets, radios and televisions carried his every word, and for the first time the people were not just listening. They were feeling it. They did not fear my position. They feared my refusal to bow," he said. "I do not answer to bankers across oceans or councils behind glass towers. I answer to the land beneath my feet and to the people who walk it." His tone never rose, but the message roared, and across Burkina Faso crowds grew still. Traoré opened a file on the desk. "What I hold in my hand is not rumor. It is fact, payments, locations, names, documents tied to an operation meant to remove me quietly." He slid one page into view, showing a marked signature from a well-known international firm. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply exposed. And the weight of truth was heavier than bullets. In one household, a father sat on the floor beside his young son, eyes fixed on the screen. The child asked, "Is he telling the truth?" The father replied, "Yes, that is why they tried to stop him." The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding the cost of truth for the first time. And in that moment, across generations, something ancient awakened trust. Back in the conference room, the same cabinet members watched the broadcast in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed. Others looked terrified. One woman, a senior economic advisor, wiped her eyes and whispered, "He's not bluffing." "No." One responded, "They knew." And the room that once conspired now sat in paralyzed reflection. Meanwhile, international media scrambled to translate, verify, and respond. Within 30 minutes, networks from South America to Eastern Europe were broadcasting headlines. President Traoré reveals attempted strike names global financiers. But it was not the headlines that mattered. It was the footage, uncut, raw, and real. It spread faster than they could contain. Traoré concluded without flourish, "I do not fear what comes next, because I did not bend. I stand because I was lifted by those who believe Africa can speak for itself. And if they strike again, I will still be here because I am not alone." He nodded once, and the screen faded to black, but the echo of his words had already circled the globe. As first light touched the rooftops of Ouagadougou, the city did not rise in chaos. It rose in clarity. People stepped into the streets, not as bystanders, but as guardians of a story that now belonged to them. No one shouted. No one marched, but every glance exchanged between strangers carried a quiet fire. Children asked their parents, why grown men stood still in silence, and mothers replied softly, because something important finally broke through. Across shops and taxi lines, Traoré's speech played again, not because it was forced, but because it was needed. Each word felt like a thread stitched into the national fabric, binding truth to dignity. And as people repeated his final words, they weren't quoting a leader. They were echoing a promise. For the first time in years, the capital wasn't bracing for conflict. It was preparing for something deeper: transformation. Thousands of miles away, inside a sterile room in Moscow, the Russian liaison stared at a frozen frame of Traoré. The moment his final sentence ended, calm, unwavering. Something changed even there. This was not rescue. The officer muttered half to himself. This was redefinition. Because the mission had never been just to save a man. It was to protect the voice of a continent, rising from under the weight of silence. In Paris, broadcasters interrupted polished headlines with shaky translation. Footage had spread before editorial boards could respond, before spin could take shape. But viewers leaned in, not out, because even through cultural distance, authenticity cuts through everything. This is the sound of a leader unafraid, one host admitted on air, and for a moment, the world turned its head toward Africa, not in pity, but in respect. Elsewhere, in hiding, the man who had betrayed Traoré stared at a dark screen, no protection detail, no comfort, just him, his guilt, and the sound of his own breath. He realized then that his fear was not about being captured. It was about being forgotten. The world now knew his name for the wrong reasons, and he would be remembered not as a strategist, but as a symbol of cowardice. Back in the palace, Ibrahim stood alone in the garden, wind brushing through the trees. His chief of intelligence approached quietly, words measured. "The momentum is with you now." But Traoré didn't answer immediately. He watched the horizon and finally said, "They planned everything except this. The people still believe in something." And belief, he knew, was more dangerous than any bullet. At a forgotten memorial in the northern district, an old man laid a note beneath weathered stone. It read, "You marched for us today. He speaks for you." The wind carried the words across the street, where a small boy picked it up and read it aloud. Then he looked at his mother and said, "I want to be like him." And somewhere in that moment, a future was rewritten, not in secret, but in the open. At the heart of Ouagadougou, an old theater reopened for the first time in over a decade, not for a performance, but for a gathering, quiet, informal, and unannounced. Inside, seats filled slowly with teachers, students, veterans, and community leaders. No tickets, no cameras, just a projector, a generator, and a reason to stay. They weren't there for entertainment. They were there for truth, played frame by frame on screen. Scenes never meant to be seen unfolded with surgical detail footage of the failed operation documents once sealed behind foreign firewalls, voice recordings between planners, speaking of Traoré not as a man, but as a problem. Gasps escaped the room not out of surprise, but recognition. The pieces fit. And as the lights dimmed again, silence returned, this time heavier than before. A young woman stood up near the aisle, her voice clear. "What do we do now?" Her question wasn't rhetorical, it was a call. An older man beside her replied, "We begin by remembering, then we protect what we've learned." Because the battle was no longer over land or law. It was over memory and who gets to write it. Elsewhere in the city, the traitorous aide was detained without ceremony. He was found in a private compound, his attempt to flee already compromised. No force was used, just presence, armed guards, silent, disciplined, final. He did not resist. He knew the weight of the silence that had followed him. His hands shook, not from fear, but from knowing he'd already lost the country that once trusted him. Back in the presidential quarters, Traoré reviewed a final set of reports. Each one outlined who remained where they stood and what they still controlled. Some were in media, others in finance, a few still inside his circle. But what mattered now wasn't elimination. It was exposure, public, transparent, undeniable. And with the momentum turning, the walls began to sweat. Far beyond Africa, university students in São Paulo debated Traoré's address on livestream. One said, "This is not just African politics. This is a shift in global language." Another replied, "Because it wasn't about power, it was about voice." The clip was translated into 14 languages in under 24 hours, and every version kept the closing line unchanged. "I was not meant to survive, but I did." That night, Ibrahim stood before a room of young cadets in training. They had not seen the ambush, but they would carry the lessons of it. He did not speak as a hero, but as a man who had chosen not to disappear. Your enemy will never knock. He told them they enter through silence and smiles. And the room once filled with youth now carried the silence of men becoming guardians. Dawn broke over the Sahel with the sky washed in deep orange and soft gray. But inside a remote military outpost near the eastern border, the mood was far from calm. Traoré had arrived without announcement, accompanied only by 2 trusted men. Soldiers rushed to attention, startled by his presence, unsure whether it was inspection or warning. But he raised a hand and said, "At ease, I came to see who still stands with truth." The outpost had once been compromised, not violently, but quietly through bribes and silence. Now it stood reclaimed, not by force, but by loyalty. Traoré walked the ground, slowly pausing to greet young soldiers with names they never thought he knew. He listened more than he spoke, nodding at complaints, at questions, at hope. And every word spoken in that dry air stitched him closer to the ground he protected. In the command center, a fresh map was laid before him. Dots marking surveillance reports, intercepted signals, patterns that formed a net of deceit. But one circle stood out, a location near the Niger border, marked in red, unverified activity. The officer said, but heavily encrypted transmissions, just like before. Traoré traced the circle with his finger and said, "That is where the next move waits." Back in the capital, the Russian liaison met with the intelligence chief behind a closed door. They shared information not as allies by convenience, but as men who understood the stakes. "Western observers are moving," the Russian said. "Your enemies won't strike again the same way." "No," the chief agreed. "They'll use economics this time, influence through currency and control." And so began a new kind of battle, not of weapons, but of systems. Meanwhile, in an elite school in the South, a young girl read her essay aloud in front of her class. The topic was courage in silence. She wrote not about soldiers, but about her mother, a street vendor who refused to raise prices during crisis, who gave food away when others hoarded. "Ibrahim Traoré reminds me of her," the girl concluded. "They both protect without shouting." The teacher wiped her eyes, and no one in that room laughed or clapped. They simply nodded. Across social platforms, the president's speech had now reached over 100 million views. But what mattered more than the numbers were the comments, thousands of messages from villagers, farmers, nurses, youth groups, and teachers. No bots, no propaganda, just stories, raw, real, reflective. And Traoré read them all not as praise, but as fuel. That night he stood alone on the balcony of a rural station, far from microphones. He watched as a bonfire flickered in the distance, surrounded by farmers sharing stories. He didn't interrupt. He just watched a man not above his people, but among them. He whispered to himself, "They tried to strike me from the sky." But they forgot the sky belongs to no empire. The red-marked site near the Niger border was no longer just a dot on a map. It had become the focal point of silent preparations watched by both satellite and soil. Russian intelligence drones hovered high above it unseen, collecting heat patterns and movements. What they found was not a rebel camp or weapon stockpile. It was a communication relay, advanced, shielded, and foreign-built. Inside a reinforced control room, Traoré stood over a live feed. The signal spikes matched those used in the failed precision strike against him. The equipment had European origin, but was rerouted through offshore holding fronts. "This is not just interference," the Russian liaison said. "This is architecture. Someone built this to stay." And now it was exposed, blinking red, on every monitored channel. Orders were given not to destroy, but to seize with full documentation. A small unit moved in at dawn, swift and disciplined, no bullets, no alarms. They extracted hard drives, pulled server cores, and documented every serial number. Among the files recovered was a list of timestamps, each one matching moments Traoré's movements had been tracked. Someone had mapped his life like a chessboard, expecting no one to ever look back. By midday, the evidence sat locked in a military vault deep beneath the capital. The top folder bore a code name in French, Spectre Doublon, Ghost of the Sand. It was not just a foreign surveillance program. It was coordinated with internal access. That confirmed what Traoré had long feared: the betrayal had layers. But now the sand had shifted, and the ghost was no longer hidden. Across the country, students began sharing news of the raid with hashtags that turned into slogans: "Eyes on the sand, Traoré sees all Africa is watching you." These were not orchestrated campaigns. They were organic, born from pride. What began as a survival story had become a lesson in vigilance. And for the first time in modern memory, Burkina Faso's youth, Wahak, felt sovereign. Far away inside a secured office in Geneva, a private call ended with a single word: abort. The man hung up, wiped sweat from his brow, and opened a drawer. Inside was a burner phone, preloaded with one name and one number erased within seconds. He whispered, "We pushed too far," and stared out at the city skyline that suddenly felt too fragile. The machine had been exposed, and machines do not bleed, but they break. Back home, Traoré watched the footage of the seized relay one more time. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply turned to his team and said, "They watched us in silence for too long now. We will speak in daylight." And as the screen faded to black, the next order was already being written. The final act was near, and this time, the world would not be allowed to look away. The next morning, a quiet message appeared on state media. At noon, the president will address the nation and the continent unfiltered. There were no previews, no leaks, no discussions, only anticipation. Shops paused, service schools adjusted schedules, and even rival broadcasters agreed to relay it. Everyone sensed what was coming. No one knew how far it would go. Traoré entered a simple room, not a golden hall, not a grand stage, just a wooden podium, a national flag, and a microphone. He wore no medals, no military decorations, only the uniform of someone who had nothing to prove. The camera didn't cut away. It stayed on his eyes. And when he began, the entire continent leaned closer. "I was not rescued by power," he said. "I was rescued by the truth that power tried to silence." He paused, then raised a small object into view, a recovered drive from the relay station. "This contains not one man's betrayal, but decades of designs to shape our votes, to control our resources, and to measure our silence. But they forgot something essential. We were never truly silent. We were listening." Across cities and villages, people listened without blinking. He listed names not for punishment, but for transparency. Bankers, operatives, diplomats, even local leaders. He did not call for violence. He called for awareness. "Do not act with anger," he said. "Act with memory." Outside the capital, farmers stopped their work to gather around a battery-powered television. Children sat on the dirt, eyes wide, repeating the president's words like proverbs. A grandmother whispered to her daughter, "We waited a lifetime to hear someone speak like this." And her daughter replied, "Then we will not let them silence him now." It was no longer just a speech. It had become a bond. In a private boardroom in Brussels, men in suits stared at the live stream in stunned silence. One of them muttered, "He crossed the line." But another leaned back and said, "No, he erased it." They understood what many still didn't. The page had turned and they no longer held the pen. As Traoré closed, he did not call for support or ask for applause. He simply said, "From this day forward, the game will no longer be played behind curtains. If you strike, know this, we now strike back with truth." The camera held his gaze one final second before fading to black, and in that second power shifted not by force, but by exposure. The days that followed were not marked by riots or gunfire. They were marked by reflection. In city squares and remote farmlands, people gathered not to protest, but to plan. Local leaders who once stayed quiet began speaking boldly in town halls and schools. Mothers formed watch groups. Teachers rewrote curriculums to include names previously erased, and everywhere one phrase repeated like a heartbeat, "We were meant to wake up." Traoré did not vanish after the address. He walked the streets unannounced, unguarded. In marketplaces, he sat with elders over tea. In classrooms, he knelt beside children learning to read their own history. He did not carry promises. He carried presence. And that presence said more than any campaign ever could. International reactions were swift, but not uniform. Some governments issued vague statements about internal matters and respect for sovereignty. Others froze assets, panicked by how much he had revealed. But the world's people, not its offices, responded differently. Artists painted him poets, quoted him, students wrote essays about him. In South Africa, a mural appeared overnight, Traoré standing with his hand open, surrounded by rising sun and windblown sand. Beneath it were 5 simple words: "Truth cannot be struck down." No one claimed the artwork, but it spread across screens and hearts within hours. A continent had found its reflection, and it looked nothing like the past. Inside the vault, the remaining files were archived untouched. Traoré had made a decision not to destroy, but to preserve. One day, he told his chief of staff, "When our children ask what almost happened, we will show them." Because silence had once been survival, but now memory had become power. On the anniversary of the failed strike, a national day of silence was held, not in mourning, but in gratitude for every second that passed without fear, for every truth brought to light. In the capital square, bells rang 13 times, once for each name revealed, and twice for the ones still hidden. As dusk returned to Ouagadougou, Traoré stood once more on the palace balcony. He looked out over his city, not as ruler, but as witness. He breathed deep, closed his eyes, and whispered one final vow: "You tried to erase me in the shadows, but now I walk in the sun." And Africa, listening, did not cheer. It stood up and walked with him. If you believe this voice must continue, do not stay silent. Subscribe to this channel, a channel that stands with Ibrahim Traoré and with the rise of a new Africa.